October 14, 1943. 4 p.m., Sobibor death camp, occupied Poland. SS Oberscharführer Rudolf Beckmann walked toward the tailor's workshop carrying a new winter coat, expecting nothing more unusual than a routine uniform fitting. The 34-year-old German guard, veteran of 2 years at Sobibor, had personally supervised the murder of approximately 100,000 Jews without incident. The camp operated with mechanical efficiency. Transports arrived, prisoners were gassed within hours, belongings sorted, bodies burned. The system seemed perfect, unbreakable. What Beckmann didn't know, what none of the SS garrison could have imagined, was that the Jewish prisoners he considered already dead had spent 5 months planning the impossible. Not escape alone, but systematic revenge followed by mass liberation. As Beckmann entered the workshop, prisoner Yehuda Lerner stepped forward, holding a measuring tape. Behind him, prisoner Shlomo Schmeisner gripped an axe taken from the camp woodshed. Beckmann would be the first of 11 SS officers to die in the next 90 minutes. The prisoners he had guarded were about to execute the most audacious revolt in Holocaust history, transforming certain death into impossible freedom. The mathematics of this uprising defied every calculation the Nazis had made about Jewish resistance. 600 prisoners, unarmed and starving, would attack 100 heavily armed SS guards and Ukrainian auxiliaries in a fortified camp designed specifically to prevent escape. The plan required perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and ruthless execution. One mistake would trigger machine gun fire that would slaughter everyone. Yet somehow, on that October afternoon, the prisoners of Sobibor achieved what Nazi ideology claimed was impossible. They fought back, they killed their murderers, and they escaped. The story of how they planned and executed this revolt reveals truths about human courage, organizational genius, and the fatal weakness in totalitarian systems that assume complete control over the powerless. The introduction. The roots of this impossibility lay 18 months earlier. March 1942, the village of Sobibor in eastern Poland near the Bug River. SS Hauptsturmführer Richard Tomala arrived with construction crews to build what Nazi planners designated as Pure Extermination Center, a factory designed solely for industrial murder. Unlike concentration camps that exploited slave labor, Sobibor would have only one purpose: kill Jews as rapidly as possible, erase all evidence, repeat endlessly. The camp that emerged covered approximately 600 by 400 meters, divided into 3 zones. Camp I held the arrival platform and sorting areas. Camp 2 contained living quarters for the 600 prisoners kept alive to operate the killing machinery. Camp 3, isolated behind barbed wire and camouflage, housed the gas chambers and burial pits. The entire facility employed about 30 SS personnel and 90 Ukrainian auxiliary guards, a force the Germans considered more than adequate to control unarmed prisoners who were deliberately kept isolated, starved, and terrorized. The first transport arrived May 1942. By October 1943, Sobibor had murdered approximately 250,000 Jews from Poland, Netherlands, France, Germany, and the Soviet Union. The operation followed a refined protocol. Trains arrived at the platform. Prisoners were separated by gender. Those selected for work were sent to Camp 2. The rest, usually 95% of each transport, were herded to Camp 3, told they were going to showers, stripped naked, and driven into gas chambers disguised as bathrooms. Carbon monoxide from captured Soviet tank engines killed them within 20 minutes. Ukrainian guards removed bodies to massive pits, sorted valuables, and burned the evidence. The 600 prisoners kept alive to operate this machinery understood they were living on borrowed time. Their survival depended on remaining useful. When usefulness ended, they would join the dead. This knowledge created desperation that Nazi planners failed to anticipate. The Germans assumed terrorized prisoners would never organize resistance. They were catastrophically wrong. The transformation from victims to fighters began with the arrival of Soviet Jewish prisoners of war in September 1943. Among them was Lieutenant Alexander Pechersky, Red Army soldier captured in October 1941, who had survived 2 years in German captivity through intelligence and will. Pechersky entered Sobibor with military training, tactical knowledge, and crucially, no illusions about Nazi intentions. Within days of arrival, he recognized that Sobibor was not a labor camp, but a death factory, and he began planning the impossible. The architecture of despair. To understand the magnitude of the uprising, one must first comprehend the totality of Nazi control at Sobibor. The camp's design reflected years of experience killing Jews across occupied Europe. Every element existed to prevent exactly what Pechersky and his fellow prisoners were planning. The perimeter consisted of 3-meter-high barbed wire fences, electrified and patrolled constantly. Watchtowers positioned every 50 meters provided overlapping fields of fire. Beyond the fences, a 15-meter-wide minefield stretched in all directions. Ukrainian guards conducted head counts 4 times daily, tracking every prisoner by number. Any discrepancy triggered immediate lockdown and searches. Guards carried automatic weapons, pistols, and grenades. Prisoners possessed nothing but work tools under constant supervision. The psychological architecture proved even more formidable. The Germans deliberately separated prisoners by transport, preventing formation of cohesive groups. They executed anyone suspected of resistance instantly, often along with random prisoners as collective punishment. They spread rumors that escape was impossible, that partisan groups in surrounding forests killed escaped Jews, that death in the gas chambers was painless, while death from escape attempts was torture. SS Oberscharführer Karl Frenzel, second in command at Sobibor, explained the system in testimony during his 1966 trial in Hagen, West Germany. The proceedings, documented in court transcripts now housed at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, revealed the Nazi confidence in their control measures. We maintained absolute discipline through selective terror. Execute 1 prisoner publicly, and 599 prisoners become compliant. The Jews who worked in Sobibor understood that resistance meant death. Compliance meant survival for another day. We never imagined they would choose collective action over individual survival. Our entire system depended on prisoners remaining atomized, desperate, and isolated. We failed to account for leadership that could overcome those divisions, but atomization had limits. The prisoners, forced to operate Sobibor's machinery, developed relationships the Germans couldn't prevent. Leon Feldhendler, a Polish Jew who had been a community leader before deportation, had survived at Sobibor since April 1942 through intelligence and caution. By 1943, Feldhendler had established an underground committee monitoring camp operations, gathering intelligence and seeking escape opportunities. When Pechersky arrived, Feldhendler recognized a crucial addition, a soldier with military training who could transform desperate hope into tactical plan. The first meeting between Feldhendler and Pechersky occurred in the prisoner barracks 2 days after the Soviet transport arrived. Esther Raab, a Polish Jewish prisoner who worked in the sorting barracks, witnessed the initial contact. Her testimony, recorded by the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale University in 1983, captured the moment. Feldhendler approached Pechersky carefully. We had seen Russian prisoners before, but they usually died quickly from the work or were selected for gassing. Pechersky was different. He carried himself like someone who hadn't been broken. Feldhendler asked if he had military experience. Pechersky said he had been an officer. Feldhendler asked if he thought escape was possible. Pechersky looked around the camp for a long moment, studying the fences, the towers, the guards. Then he said something I will never forget. Escape alone is impossible. Armed revolt followed by mass escape might succeed. But it requires perfect planning and absolute commitment. Everyone must be willing to die. Feldhendler smiled for the first time in months. That we already have. The mathematics of murder, the prisoners planning revolt, faced mathematical realities that would have deterred rational minds. The SS garrison at Sobibor, though small, possessed overwhelming firepower and tactical advantages. 30 SS men and 90 Ukrainian guards versus 600 unarmed, starving prisoners. The guards controlled automatic weapons, pistols, grenades, and machine guns in watchtowers. The prisoners controlled axes, knives, and woodworking tools. But Pechersky recognized asymmetries the Germans had overlooked. The SS officers rarely moved in groups. They inspected workshops individually, confident in their invulnerability. The Ukrainians, while numerous, were poorly motivated and often drunk. The camp's isolation, designed to prevent outside help, also meant no rapid reinforcement. Most crucially, the Germans had become complacent. 2 years of perfect control had convinced them resistance was impossible. Pechersky spent the first 2 weeks conducting reconnaissance disguised as learning camp routines. He timed guard patrols, he mapped the location of weapons stores, he identified which SS officers followed predictable schedules. He studied the Ukrainian guard posts and recognized that the guards facing outward, watching for external threats, couldn't see the camp interior. Every detail became data for tactical planning. The underground committee expanded to include 12 corps organizers, representing different barracks and work details. They met in whispers during work, communicating through coded phrases and signals. The challenge they faced was unprecedented. Traditional escape attempts focused on cutting fences or digging tunnels. Pechersky proposed something far more audacious. Kill the SS leadership simultaneously in multiple locations, seize their weapons, overwhelm the Ukrainian guards, then lead a mass breakout before reinforcements arrived. The plan that emerged over 5 weeks of clandestine meetings reflected both brilliance and desperation. The SS officers would be lured to various workshops under routine pretexts, isolated uniforms to be fitted, boots to be repaired, furniture to be inspected. In each location, prisoner teams would kill the officer, silently using axes and knives, take his weapons, and hide the body. The killings would occur between 4 Summer p.m. and 5 Onaust p.m., during the hour when the camp operated with reduced supervision as guards changed shifts. Thomas Blatt, a Polish Jewish prisoner who was 16 years old in October 1943, participated in the planning sessions. His memoir, published in 1997 as From the Ashes of Sobibor, documented the psychological transformation required. We were discussing murder in cold blood, not self-defense in combat, but premeditated assassination of specific individuals. Many prisoners struggled with this morally. We had been raised to believe killing was wrong. Pechersky was blunt. These men have murdered 250,000 people. They will murder us tomorrow or next week. This is not murder. This is war. We are soldiers fighting for survival. That framing helped, but it didn't make the actual planning less horrifying. We were selecting which prisoner would kill which SS officer, practicing with axes how to strike a killing blow, discussing how to hide bodies so the next officer wouldn't see evidence. It felt insane, but the alternative was waiting for our own deaths. The selection of prisoners for killing teams reflected brutal pragmatism. The committee chose men who had lost families in the gas chambers, who carried rage alongside despair. Each team included both a killer and assistants to subdue the victim and dispose of the body. The weapons selected, axes, knives, and hidden pistols taken from sorting barracks, had to kill silently. Gunfire would alert the entire camp and trigger immediate massacre. Yehuda Lerner, assigned to kill SS Oberscharführer Rudolf Beckmann in the tailor shop, described the preparation in testimony to the USC Shoah Foundation in 1996. They chose me because I was strong from working in construction, and because my wife and daughter had died in the gas chambers 2 months earlier. I had nothing to lose. They showed me exactly where to strike with the axe, how to swing for maximum force, what to do if the first blow didn't kill. We practiced on logs, measuring angles and force. It was grotesque, rehearsing murder like a stage play. But every time I wanted to refuse, I thought of my daughter's face as they took her to Camp 3. That gave me the strength to continue. The fatal schedule. The revolt's success depended on exploiting German punctuality. The SS officers followed rigid schedules, a predictability born from confidence and routine. Pechersky's plan weaponized this regularity. Each officer would be lured to a killing site at a precise time, ensuring simultaneous elimination of leadership before any alarm could spread. The schedule evolved through patient observation. SS Oberscharführer Joseph Vallaster inspected the shoemaker's workshop every day at 4:60 p.m. SS Scharführer Rudolf Zimmermann checked carpentry work at 4:10 p.m. SS Unterscharführer Johann Greischutz visited the tailor shop at 4:15 p.m. These patterns, maintained for months, became the framework for mass murder of the murderers. October 14th was selected because intelligence indicated that Camp Commandant SS Hauptsturmführer Franz Reich-Leitner would be absent, visiting Lublin. His deputy, SS Oberscharführer Johann Niemann, a sadist who personally enjoyed killing, would be in command, making him the primary target. Niemann's death would decapitate leadership at the crucial moment. The morning of October 14th, 1943, began with normal routine. Prisoners assembled for morning roll call at 6 a.m. Work details dispersed to their assignments. Ukrainian guards took positions in watchtowers and along fence lines. The SS officers conducted inspections, shouted orders, and beat prisoners who moved too slowly. Nothing indicated that this day would end in catastrophe for the Germans and liberation for the prisoners. But beneath the surface, the revolt was already in motion. Prisoner work teams had spent the night moving weapons to predetermined locations. Axes wrapped in cloth lay hidden in workshops. Knives were concealed in work benches. A small number of pistols and grenades, smuggled from sorting barracks where prisoners processed belongings of murdered victims, were distributed to team leaders. The prisoners who would serve as killers prepared mentally, knowing that hesitation would mean death for everyone. Shlomo Schmeisner, a Brazilian Jewish teenager assigned to the metal workshop, was selected for the first team targeting SS Oberscharführer Joseph Vallaster. His testimony, recorded in multiple interviews before his death in 1989, revealed the terrible clarity of those final hours. I woke up October 14th knowing I would either die that day or escape. There was no middle possibility. At breakfast, I looked at the other prisoners and wondered how many would survive. I'd practiced killing motions hundreds of times in my mind. When the moment came, I would have perhaps 2 seconds to strike before Vallaster could react. If I failed, if the blow wasn't fatal, he would shoot me and sound the alarm. 600 people depended on me swinging an axe perfectly. I was 17 years old. The first blood. At precisely 4 p.m., SS Oberscharführer Josef Vallaster entered the shoemaker's workshop to inspect a pair of boots being crafted for him. He was accompanied by prisoner Yakov Biskowitz, who had invited him under pretense that the boots were ready for fitting. Vallaster sat on a bench, removed his pistol belt, as was his custom during fittings, and began examining the leatherwork. He never saw Shlomo Schmeisner step from the shadows behind him. The first blow struck Vallaster at the base of the skull with such force that the axe embedded in bone. Vallaster made no sound beyond a grunt. The second blow, delivered by Yakov Biskowitz using a shoemaker's knife to the throat, ensured death. Blood sprayed across the workshop floor. Prisoners covered the body with cloth and dragged it into a storage closet. Schmeisner retrieved Vallaster's pistol and ammunition. The revolt had begun. At 4:01 p.m., Over the next 23 minutes, 10 more SS officers died in 6 different locations across the camp. Each killing followed the same pattern. An officer entered a workshop expecting routine inspection. Prisoner teams struck from behind with axes, knives, or improvised weapons. Bodies were hidden, weapons seized. The synchronization proved nearly perfect, testament to months of planning and desperate determination. At 4:15 p.m., SS Oberscharführer Rudolf Beckmann entered the tailor shop where Yehuda Lerner waited with an axe. Beckmann commented on the quality of coat tailoring, turning his back to examine fabric. Lerner struck once, killing him instantly. At 4:17 p.m., SS Unterscharführer Johann Greischutz died in the carpentry shop, killed by prisoner Semyon Rosenfeld with a mallet blow to the temple. At 4:20 p.m., SS Scharführer Rudolf Zimmermann was stabbed to death in the garage by prisoners Arkady Weispapier and Jakov Biskowitz. The most crucial target was SS Oberscharführer Johann Niemann, the acting camp commandant. Niemann had a reputation for exceptional cruelty. He personally conducted selections, choosing who lived and who went to the gas chambers. He beat prisoners with riding crops. He shot children in front of their parents. The prisoners wanted him dead, not just strategically, but morally. Niemann was lured to the SS compound under pretense that a captured rabbit needed his approval for dinner. Prisoner Alexander Peshersky and prisoner Boris Chaibulski waited in the building. When Niemann entered at 4:30 p.m., Peshersky struck him in the head with an axe, while Chaibulski stabbed him repeatedly. Niemann, one of the most feared men in the camp, died without firing a shot. His death severed the SS command structure at the critical moment. Selma Weinberg, a Dutch Jewish prisoner who worked in the sorting barracks, witnessed the revolt's early stages from a window. Her testimony, preserved in the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation Archives, captured the surreal transformation. I was watching the camp yard when I saw Peshersky and several other prisoners walking toward the SS barracks, carrying an axe very obviously. My first thought was insane. They'll be shot immediately. But no alarm sounded. Minutes later, they emerged wiping blood from their hands. I realized something extraordinary was happening. The Germans who had seemed invincible were being hunted, killed like they had killed us. I felt terror and exhilaration simultaneously. If the revolt succeeded, we might live. If it failed, we would certainly die. But at least we would die fighting. The moment of choice. At 5 p.m., 11 SS officers lay dead. Their weapons had been distributed to prisoner teams. The moment approached when the entire camp of 600 prisoners would have to choose between certain death and possible freedom. The plan called for a 5:30 p.m. assembly, where Peshersky would announce the revolt and lead a mass breakout through the main gate. But events accelerated beyond control. A Ukrainian guard discovered the body of SS Unterscharführer Walter Reiber in the carpenter's workshop at 5:10 p.m. The guard fired his rifle in alarm, the sound echoing across the camp. The element of surprise evaporated. Peshersky made an instant decision. Rather than wait for planned assembly, he began shouting in Russian, German, and Yiddish. "Comrades, the revolt has begun. The SS officers are dead. We have weapons. Follow me to freedom or die here like sheep. Everyone to the main gate. Now, run." The response revealed the psychological complexity of prisoners who had spent months in death camp conditions. Some reacted immediately, grabbing tools and running toward Peshersky. Others stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Some hid in barracks, convinced the revolt would fail and participation would bring torture. The Germans had succeeded in breaking some prisoners so completely that even offered freedom, they couldn't accept it. Chaim Engel, a Polish Jewish prisoner who worked in the goldsmith shop, described the chaos in testimony recorded by Steven Spielberg's Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation in 1996. When Pechersky started shouting, my first thought was that he had gone insane. My second thought was that this was the moment we had planned for. My third thought was paralysis. I stood there like an idiot while other prisoners ran past me. Then I saw a Ukrainian guard raise his rifle and shoot a prisoner in the back. The man fell dead 5 meters from me. That broke my paralysis. I grabbed a knife from my workbench and ran toward the gate. I didn't think about surviving. I thought about not dying like all the others, passively, waiting for the gas. If I was going to die, it would be running toward freedom, not waiting for murder. The breakout became a chaotic rush toward the main gate and fences. Ukrainian guards in watchtowers opened fire with machine guns. Prisoners fell by the dozens, but others kept coming. Some prisoners armed with seized German weapons returned fire, forcing guards to take cover. Pechersky led the largest group toward the main gate, where Ukrainian guards retreated rather than face hundreds of desperate prisoners. The minefield beyond the fences created new horror. Prisoners running through the mine zone triggered explosions that killed or wounded dozens. But the sheer number of escapees meant many survived the crossing. Those who made it into the forest beyond kept running, scattering in all directions to prevent organized pursuit. Thomas Blatt, running with a group of prisoners, later described the escape through the minefield in his memoir. We ran in a mass toward the fence. I saw prisoners shot in the head, the chest, the back. I saw a woman blown apart by a mine, her body just disintegrating. I ran over people who had fallen. I jumped over bodies. I heard screaming behind me and machine gun fire and explosions. I expected to die every second. Then suddenly I was in trees, and the camp was behind me. I had escaped hell, but I was bleeding from shrapnel wounds and lost in a Polish forest with no idea where to go. Freedom didn't feel like victory. It felt like temporary reprieve from death. The cost of freedom. The statistical accounting of the Sobibor uprising reveals both triumph and tragedy. Of approximately 600 prisoners in the camp on October 14th, about 400 attempted escape during the revolt. Ukrainian guards and remaining SS personnel killed approximately 100 prisoners during the breakout. Another 100 died in the minefield. Roughly 200 prisoners made it into the forest alive, but survival in the forest brought new dangers that proved nearly as deadly as the camp itself. The region surrounding Sobibor was hostile territory for escaped Jews. Polish partisans, though fighting the Germans, often murdered Jewish escapees due to anti-Semitism. Ukrainian peasants, some of whom had collaborated with Nazi deportations, frequently turned in Jews for rewards. German patrols swept the forests for weeks, hunting survivors. Of the 200 who escaped Sobibor, approximately 150 died in the subsequent months from combat, betrayal, exposure, or execution. Only about 50 Sobibor prisoners survived the war. They scattered across Poland and the Soviet Union, hiding in forests, joining partisan groups, or finding refuge with rare individuals willing to risk death to shelter Jews. Each survival represented extraordinary luck combined with determination. Selma Weinberg and Chaim Engel, who had begun a relationship in Sobibor, escaped together and survived in Polish forests until Soviet forces arrived in 1944. They married after the war and immigrated to the United States. In interviews conducted decades later, they reflected on the impossible odds they overcame. Weinberg stated in 1983 testimony, "We survived because we had each other, and because the revolt gave us weapons and a head start. Without Pechersky's planning, we would have died in Sobibor like 250,000 others. The fact that only 50 of us survived might seem like failure. But against what we faced, 50 survivors represents a miracle. The German response to the revolt demonstrated both rage and panic. SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler ordered Sobibor dismantled immediately to prevent international attention. The gas chambers were destroyed, the buildings razed, and trees planted over the site. Ukrainian guards who failed to prevent the escape were executed. The SS personnel who survived, including Camp Commandant Franz Reichleitner, who had been absent during the revolt, were reassigned or court-martialed. But the Nazis couldn't erase what had happened. The Sobibor uprising became known to Jewish resistance groups across occupied Europe within weeks. The knowledge that death camp prisoners had successfully revolted, killed their guards, and escaped inspired desperate hope in other camps. It proved that resistance was possible, that Nazi control wasn't absolute, that dignity could be reclaimed even in the machinery of genocide. The weapon of testimony. The survivors who lived to see liberation carried responsibility beyond personal survival. They became witnesses to atrocities the world struggled to believe. In the immediate post-war period, many people couldn't accept that industrial murder on Sobibor's scale had occurred. The survivors' testimony provided evidence that contradicted denial. Alexander Pechersky, the military officer whose tactical brilliance enabled the revolt, survived the war fighting with Soviet partisans. After liberation, he returned to the Soviet Union, where his status as a former German prisoner made him suspect under Stalin's regime. He was interrogated, imprisoned briefly, and forbidden from discussing his Holocaust experiences publicly. Not until the 1960s could Pechersky openly describe Sobibor. His detailed accounts, published in Russian journals and translated internationally, provided crucial documentation of the camp's operations and the uprising. In 1964, Pechersky testified at the trial of 11 former Sobibor guards in Hagen, West Germany. The FAPO proceedings, lasting over a year, exposed the camp's systematic murder and the guards' enthusiastic participation. Pechersky's testimony, detailing how prisoners planned and executed the revolt, demonstrated that victims were not passive. The court convicted several defendants, though sentences were controversially light. Thomas Blatt spent decades tracking down Sobibor perpetrators and advocating for justice. He testified at multiple war crimes trials, provided evidence to historians, and wrote extensively about his experiences. In his memoir, he explained the burden survivors carried. We didn't just escape Sobibor, we escaped with the responsibility to tell what happened there. The Nazis tried to erase all evidence. They murdered the witnesses, destroyed the buildings, planted trees. They wanted Sobibor to disappear, as if 250,000 murders never occurred. Every survivor who testified, who wrote, who remembered aloud, prevented that erasure. Our survival had to mean something beyond just living. It had to mean bearing witness. The testimony of Sobibor survivors contributed to the historical record documenting the Holocaust. Their accounts corroborated evidence from Nazi documents, archaeological investigations, and other witness testimony. Organizations like the USC Shoah Foundation, the Fortunoff Video Archive, and Yad Vashem collected thousands of hours of survivor testimony, preserving first-hand accounts for future generations. These testimonies revealed details that documents alone could never capture. The psychological experience of living in a death factory. The moment-by-moment decisions that meant survival or death. The human connections that sustained dignity and degradation. The planning sessions where desperate prisoners became tactical fighters. The moral complexity of killing their killers. The terror and exhilaration of the escape. The decades of trauma that followed liberation. Esther Raab, who escaped during the uprising and survived in forests until Soviet liberation, spent her later life educating students about Sobibor. In a 1995 interview, she reflected on why testimony mattered. When I speak to students, they ask how we found the courage to revolt. I tell them we didn't find courage. We found absolute necessity. The choice was fight or die passively. Pechersky showed us that fighting was possible. That transformed everything. But here's what students need to understand. The revolt didn't happen because we were special people. It happened because we were ordinary people pushed beyond endurance, led by someone with military knowledge and moral clarity. That combination created the impossible. and it must be remembered so future generations understand that resistance is always possible, even in the darkest circumstances. The mathematics of resistance. The Sobibor uprising succeeded for reasons the Germans never anticipated. Nazi ideology assumed Jews were racially inferior, incapable of organized violence, and psychologically broken by terror. These assumptions created blind spots that Pechersky exploited ruthlessly. The German force structure at Sobibor reflected this contempt. Only 30 SS personnel controlled 600 prisoners, a ratio that would be impossible if the prisoners were actually considered dangerous. The SS relied on Ukrainian auxiliaries, poorly trained collaborators, motivated primarily by pay and hatred. The Germans never imagined that starved, traumatized prisoners could organize a military-style operation requiring coordination, secrecy, and execution. But Pechersky brought military expertise the Germans didn't expect prisoners to possess. As a Red Army lieutenant, he understood tactics, timing, and the importance of decapitating command structure. He recognized that killing the SS leadership simultaneously would create confusion among Ukrainian guards, buying crucial minutes for mass escape. He trained prisoner teams in silent killing techniques. He maintained operational security through compartmentalization, ensuring most prisoners didn't know the full plan until execution. The revolt also succeeded because Pechersky made brutal calculations about acceptable losses. He knew many prisoners would die during the breakout. He knew the minefield would kill dozens. He accepted these casualties as his inevitable cost of attempting freedom. This tactical ruthlessness, born from military training and desperate necessity, distinguished the Sobibor uprising from earlier, smaller escape attempts that failed through caution. Dr. Jules Schelvis, a Dutch Jewish survivor who lost his wife and entire family at Sobibor, analyzed the revolt's success in his scholarly work, Sobibor, A History of a Nazi Death Camp, published in 2007. Pechersky succeeded where others failed because he understood this was war, not escape. He didn't try to sneak out. He planned a military assault on enemy forces followed by tactical retreat. This required killing without hesitation, accepting casualties without pause, and maintaining operational discipline under extreme stress. That combination of military mindset and desperate determination created the only successful death camp revolt in Holocaust history. The Nazis learned from Sobibor. After the uprising, security at remaining death camps increased dramatically. Guard numbers tripled. Prisoners were kept under even more severe restrictions. Plans for future camps incorporated lessons from Sobibor's failure. But these changes came too late. By October 1943, the peak of extermination operations had passed. Soviet forces were advancing westward. The Nazi Empire was contracting. Sobibor's prisoners had struck at precisely the moment when German confidence exceeded their actual control. The fatal assumption. The fundamental Nazi error at Sobibor was ideological. The racial theories that justified genocide also blinded perpetrators to resistance potential. German training materials described Jews as cowardly, weak, and incapable of military action. This belief created a self-fulfilling prophecy of contempt that led to inadequate security. Testimonies from captured SS personnel reveal this fatal mindset. During post-war interrogations, former Sobibor guards expressed genuine shock that prisoners had successfully revolted. They described it as betrayal rather than resistance, as if victims owed compliance to murderers. This psychological disconnect, the inability to recognize prisoners as rational actors, capable of planning and violence, created vulnerabilities Pechersky exploited. SS Oberscharführer Karl Frenzel, second in command at Sobibor, who survived the uprising because he was on leave October 14th, testified at his 1966 trial with revealing bitterness. "We treated the work Jews well. They had food, shelter, better conditions than concentration camp prisoners. We didn't understand why they would revolt. The irrationality shocked us. Of course, we would have killed them eventually, they knew this. But by working, they lived longer. The revolt was suicide. Most died in the escape. This made no sense. The prosecution highlighted the obscene logic. Frenzel couldn't comprehend prisoners choosing uncertain death through resistance over certain death through compliance. The Nazi worldview couldn't accommodate the idea that victims might prefer dying while fighting to dying while submitting. This cognitive blindness created the operational space for Pechersky's plan. The Sobibor uprising exposed a truth about totalitarian control. Absolute power creates illusion of absolute security. The SS assumed their weapons, their fences, their systematic terror guaranteed compliance. They never considered that desperation creates courage, that military leadership could emerge from prisoner ranks, that the condemned might accept near-certain death for small chance of freedom. This miscalculation was strategic, not tactical. Even after Sobibor, Nazi leadership dismissed it as an anomaly. They didn't fundamentally reassess their security doctrine because doing so would require admitting their racial ideology was false. If Jews could organize sophisticated military revolt, then perhaps Jews weren't the subhuman parasites Nazi theory claimed. That admission would undermine the entire ideological foundation of genocide. So the Germans explained Sobibor as exceptional circumstances, bad luck, and incompetent guards rather than systematic failure. The legacy of defiance. The Sobibor uprising matters beyond its immediate tactical success. It demonstrated that even in history's darkest circumstances, organized resistance remains possible. The prisoners who revolted weren't exceptional individuals. They were ordinary people, tailors, carpenters, metalworkers, driven to extraordinary action by extraordinary circumstances and competent leadership. The revolt's planning phase revealed organizational genius born from desperation. The underground committee met in whispers, communicated through codes, maintained absolute secrecy for months while under constant surveillance. They planned simultaneous killings across multiple locations with no modern communication tools. They trained teams in murder techniques without arousing suspicion. They maintained morale among prisoners who had every reason to succumb to despair. This operational sophistication contradicted Nazi assumptions about Jewish capabilities and provided a model for resistance elsewhere. Knowledge of Sobibor's success spread through underground networks to other camps. Prisoners in Treblinka, learning that Sobibor prisoners had successfully revolted, launched their own uprising in August 1943. Though Treblinka's revolt also resulted in high casualties, it demonstrated that death camp resistance was spreading. The Nazis could murder efficiently, but they couldn't prevent prisoners from choosing how they would die. The long-term impact extended to post-war Holocaust education and remembrance. The Sobibor uprising became a teaching tool demonstrating that victimhood doesn't equal passivity. Survivors who participated in the revolt carried themselves with justified pride. They had transformed from condemned victims into armed resistors. They had killed their murderers and escaped the impossible. This narrative of agency and resistance complicated simplistic Holocaust narratives that portrayed Jews solely as helpless victims. Ada Lichtman, a Polish Jewish prisoner who escaped during the uprising and survived the war in hiding, explained this distinction in 1985 testimony. For years after liberation, people asked how we let the Holocaust happen, as if we chose it, as if we were passive. Sobibor proved we weren't passive. We fought when we could. We organized when possible. We killed Nazis and escaped their death factory. Yes, most who tried died. But we tried. That matters. It matters that the world knows Jews resisted, that even in extermination camps, we found ways to fight back. Sobibor wasn't our only resistance, but it was the most successful death camp revolt. That legacy belongs to all who participated, living and dead. The archaeological investigation of Sobibor, conducted in the 2000s by teams from Israel, Netherlands, and Poland, uncovered physical evidence of the camp's operations and the revolt. Excavations found the gas chamber foundations, personal items from victims, and German weapons likely taken by prisoners during the uprising. These findings corroborated survivor testimony and provided tangible connection to events the Nazis tried to erase. A memorial and museum at the Sobibor site, dedicated in 2020, honors the murdered and celebrates the uprising. The design incorporates a symbolic pathway representing the journey from arrival platform to gas chambers, with the path eventually leading upward towards sky, representing the prisoners' revolt and escape. Educational programs at the site teach students about both the genocide and the resistance, ensuring that Sobibor's story encompasses horror and heroism. Conclusion: the impossible made real. On October 14, 1943, at precisely 4 p.m., SS Oberscharführer Rudolf Beckmann entered the tailor shop expecting a coat fitting. 23 minutes later, 11 SS officers lay dead across Sobibor. 90 minutes after that, approximately 200 prisoners had escaped into Polish forests. The death camp, designed for perfect efficiency, had suffered catastrophic revolt. The Jews the Nazis considered already dead had killed their murderers and chosen freedom. The mathematics of Sobibor defied Nazi calculations at every level. The Germans assumed 600 starving, terrorized prisoners couldn't organize military revolt. They were wrong. The SS believed their weapons and watchtowers guaranteed control. They were wrong. The Nazis thought Jewish prisoners lacked courage and capability for armed resistance. They were catastrophically wrong. Alexander Pechersky, the Red Army officer whose tactical genius enabled the uprising, survived to see Nazi Germany defeated. In his final interviews before death in 1990, he reflected on Sobibor's meaning. "We were told we were subhuman, that we existed only to be murdered, that resistance was impossible. We proved every Nazi assumption false. We organized, we planned. We killed our killers. We escaped. Yes, many died. Most who escaped died in the forests. But 50 of us survived to bear witness, and we destroyed Sobibor. The Nazis razed the camp to hide evidence of our revolt. They succeeded in hiding the murders, but couldn't hide the resistance. That is our victory. Not that we all survived, but that we fought back. The prisoners of Sobibor weren't soldiers by training or experience. They were civilians, families, communities rounded up for extermination. But under Pechersky's leadership and Leon Feldhendler's underground organization, they transformed into fighting force capable of complex military operation. They maintained absolute secrecy for months under constant surveillance. They executed synchronized killings with improvised weapons. They conducted mass breakout through minefields and machine gun fire. They achieved what Nazi ideology claimed impossible. The cost proved terrible. 3/4 of those who attempted escape died during the revolt or in subsequent months. The 50 who survived to liberation carried trauma and loss that never fully healed. They had witnessed industrial murder, participated in desperate violence, and lost everyone they loved to genocide. Liberation didn't end their suffering. It transformed it into survivors' guilt and the burden of testimony. But those 50 survivors prevented Nazi erasure of Sobibor. Their testimony documented 250,000 murders and one extraordinary revolt. Their witness statements at war crimes trials helped convict perpetrators. Their educational work taught generations about both genocide and resistance. Their very existence proved that Nazi power, though overwhelming, was never absolute. The lesson of Sobibor extends beyond Holocaust history. It demonstrates that totalitarian control creates illusions of permanence that can be shattered by organized resistance and competent leadership. The Nazis built Sobibor to be escape-proof, revolt-proof, hope-proof. But they couldn't account for military officer among the prisoners who could teach tactics to desperate men. They couldn't prevent human bonds forming among the condemned. They couldn't eliminate the fundamental human drive for dignity and freedom even under the most extreme oppression. Esther Raab, who escaped Sobibor and devoted her later life to Holocaust education, offered final reflection in 1998 testimony recorded shortly before her death. When I speak to students, they want to know if I feel victorious about the revolt. I tell them victory is the wrong word. We experienced necessary resistance. We couldn't stop the genocide. We couldn't save the 250,000 already murdered. We could only choose how we would face our own deaths. Pechersky gave us the option to die fighting instead of die waiting. Most who chose that option still died, but they died as resistors, not victims. That distinction matters profoundly. The Nazis wanted us to be ash and silence. The uprising ensured we became history and testimony. That is what survival required. Not living through it, though 50 of us did, but making certain the world would know what happened and how we fought back. The statistical record captures Sobibor's dual nature. Approximately 250,000 Jews murdered between May 1942 and October 1943. Approximately 600 prisoners remaining alive on October 14, 1943. Approximately 400 attempting escape. Approximately 200 reaching the forest. Approximately 50 surviving the war. These numbers document both unprecedented evil and unprecedented resistance. From the arrival of Alexander Pechersky in September 1943 to the revolt's execution on October 14th, the transformation from condemned victims to armed resistors required 35 days of clandestine planning and absolute determination. In those 5 weeks, tailors, carpenters, metalworkers, and laborers became an organized fighting force. Civilians learned to kill efficiently. Underground leaders coordinated complex operations under constant threat of discovery and execution. The prisoners who died during the revolt, shot in the breakout, or killed in the minefield, achieved something the Nazis tried to prevent. They chose their manner of death. They died advancing toward freedom, not waiting for murder. They transformed from helpless victims into combatants. That psychological shift from accepting fate to seizing agency represented complete rejection of Nazi power. The Sobibor uprising remains history's most successful death camp revolt, measured by escapees and Nazi casualties. It forced the Germans to completely dismantle the camp, destroying evidence but also ending the killing. It inspired resistance elsewhere. It proved that even in mechanized genocide's heart, organized resistance could succeed. That legacy belongs to all who participated. Thomas Blatt, who survived both the camp and the revolt, lived until 2015. In his final years, he worked tirelessly to preserve Sobibor's memory and hunt remaining perpetrators. His last published reflection, written weeks before his death, returned to the fundamental question: was the revolt worth it when so many died attempting escape? The answer is yes, absolutely yes. Because the alternative was certain death with no dignity, no resistance, no choice. The revolt gave us choice. Most chose to run toward possible freedom over certain murder. That so many died running toward freedom doesn't diminish the revolt's meaning. It confirms it. We were human beings reclaiming agency in a place designed to reduce us to ash. Some of us survived. All of us resisted. That is Sobibor's truth. The Germans who operated Sobibor tried to hide their crimes. They destroyed the gas chambers, burned documents, planted trees over mass graves. They executed Ukrainian witnesses, reassigned SS personnel, denied everything. But they couldn't kill all 50 survivors. They couldn't erase the testimony. They couldn't prevent the archaeological evidence from being discovered decades later. Most importantly, they couldn't erase the fact that on October 14, 1943, their perfect system of control shattered. The prisoners they had condemned fought back. The guards they considered invincible died with axes in their schools. The fences they thought escape-proof were crossed by desperate men and women running toward freedom. The death camp they built for absolute efficiency was destroyed by the very people it was designed to murder. That is the Sobibor uprising's enduring message. Power, no matter how overwhelming, is never absolute. Resistance, no matter how impossible it appears, is always possible. The condemned, given leadership and opportunity, can become liberators. The ash the Nazis intended to create instead became testimony that will never be silenced. Alexander Pechersky's tactical plan succeeded because it acknowledged brutal reality. Most would die. But dying while fighting was better than dying while waiting. That calculation, shared by 400 prisoners who attempted escape, created history's greatest death camp revolt. 50 survived to tell the story. 250,000 murdered could not, but the revolt ensured their murders would be documented, their lives remembered, and their killers identified and, in some cases, brought to justice. The Sobibor uprising proved that genocide, though it can murder millions, cannot destroy the human capacity for resistance, dignity, and testimony. The Nazis built factories for death. The prisoners of Sobibor transformed one into a battleground and won their impossible freedom.